Essentially, the bodies of both Anthony and Michael Spilotro showed very similar injuries. The injuries were primarily blunt force injuries.
We're worried about...
You guys gotta cut it out, I'm warning you now, all right?
Spilotro would eventually be linked to as many as 25 mob-related killings. Witnesses died. Spilotro never did suffer a conviction for a violent crime.
Anthony Spilotro, Tough Tony, Tony the Ant. In a town rightly or wrongly labeled as an organized crime stronghold, it was Spilotro who personified the public perception of mob influence and underworld style. The FBI tailed him for a decade, trying to put together a case that would put Spilotro behind bars. In the end, it may have been former friends and allies who took Tony off the streets permanently, perhaps making law enforcement's job easier.
By the time Spilotro made his move to Las Vegas, it would make the evening news in Chicago.
A man by the name of Tony Spilotro has attracted the attention of law enforcement officials, some of whom think Spilotro is the most cunning and dangerous member of the crime syndicate.
In 1963, Spilotro was accused of the murder of a loan shark. Spilotro was acquitted when his co-defendant was shotgunned to death. In 1979, Spilotro suffered 2 convictions for filing a false loan application. The sentence, a $1 fine. In 1974, Spilotro was arrested here in Las Vegas for murder. The case was dropped. Later that year, Spilotro was accused of defrauding the Teamsters Union. All of the defendants, including some of the top men in the Chicago mob, were acquitted after the untimely death of the prosecution's star witness. A 1981 racketeering case is still pending in court. Prosecutors were appealing that case.
Do you think the bodies were in the grave for what period of time?
The bodies had been in the grave for several days, at least a week and possibly longer.
A longtime Chicago mob observer reported,
"Some predict Tony will take a big fall someday, but it hasn't happened yet. So far, Spilotro has lived a charmed life."
That charmed life ended last week. If the killers follow true to form of most mob hits, Spilotro's murderers will likely go unpunished. Mark Fierro, Eyewitness News 8.
Earlier this morning, detectives and federal agents invaded a junkyard in DuPage County, just west of Chicago. They thought they might find the bodies of the 2 Spilotros. A tipster had told the feds that a gray Oldsmobile allegedly used in the abduction of the brothers could be found there. In keeping with the legendary MO of the Chicago mob, officials fully expected that they might find corpses inside the trunk of the automobile. In the end, they found nothing to tie the junkyard or any of the cars there to the Spilotro disappearance, and the search was called off. But late today, there was a minor breakthrough on another front in this investigation. You'll remember yesterday we told you that law enforcement officers had been unable to determine the whereabouts of 2 top Spilotro lieutenants, Paulie Shiro of Scottsdale, Arizona, and Joey Hansen of Marina del Rey, California. Well, today police are reporting that they've spotted Hansen in Los Angeles and that he seems hale and hearty. Shiro, however, is still reported to be among the missing, and officials are said to be intensifying their efforts to determine his whereabouts.
Essentially, the bodies of both Anthony and Michael Spilotro showed very similar injuries. The injuries were primarily blunt force injuries. They were about the head, the neck, and the chest, and to some extent the extremities. There was injury to the neck, but no evidence that there was actually a strangulation.
In 1983, Spilotro was tried for the torture murder of 2 Chicago street punks. He was acquitted. There were at least 15 other arrests, not a single conviction. Law enforcement officials had yet to beat Spilotro in court.
I think that his passing now will probably have an effect of somewhat of a deterrent in lessening the crime rate here in Las Vegas.
Federal authorities believe that Chicago underworld leaders entrusted Las Vegas to Spilotro to supervise loan sharking, burglary rings, extortion, and other rackets. Ferran says operations will be disrupted without an iron-fisted boss man.
Some victims may, victims being those who borrowed the money, may find themselves getting a pass because there is nobody here to collect. There may also be individuals at a lower level than was Spilotro and others who may still be around collecting. Mr. Spilotro's death now leaves the alleged overseer of Las Vegas spot vacant.
Ferran explains that with dozens of crime figures from Chicago, New York, and other cities recently convicted or indicted, there may be a shortage of mob men available who could run Las Vegas's rackets as profitably and as efficiently as federal authorities believe Spilotro did. Richard Urey, Eyewitness News 8.
As the bodies of Anthony and Michael Spilotro were finally released by authorities, the families of the reputed mobsters learned that the Chicago Archdiocese has forbidden a public church funeral. It's not the first time church officials here have taken that stand where organized crime is involved. To avoid scandalizing the faithful, Joseph Little Caesar DeVarco was denied a public mass last January, but DeVarco had been found guilty of racketeering and died while in federal custody. A spokeswoman for the Archdiocese says even though the Spilotro brothers were never found guilty by any jury, their reputation for involvement with organized crime is well known.
It seems to me that the church is going by whatever is read in the newspaper, and the stuff that's been in the newspaper has just been vicious. It's been lies.
Vic Sampanetti has been friends with the Spilotros since childhood. He says the family is very disappointed.
I'm very bitter. I can't understand it. The church teaches our children love and forgiveness, and yet I don't see the church practicing love and forgiveness.
Most observers think the decision is based more on Anthony Spilotro's reputation as the mob's man in Las Vegas. The parish where Michael Spilotro was a member has been flooded with phone calls. Even the pastor disagrees with the attempt to avoid scandal.
All I can do is to actually empathize with the family, and I offer to say a memorial mass at a subsequent date if they would like me to do so.
The Archdiocese states that this is not a judgment about eternal salvation, nor about moral guilt or innocence, that it is seeking to respect both the needs of the family and the needs of the entire church community. Funeral services without the public mass are scheduled for Friday.
The New Jersey governor's stern public warning, of course, amounted to little more than whistling in a graveyard. Out with the old, in with the new. Gambling had come to Atlantic City's boardwalk in a big way in 1977. And America's Mafia viewed it as another golden goose, ready to be plucked. But who would do the plucking? New York's five families? Meyer Lansky and his Miami associates? What about the Chicago boys and their allies? By 1977, an aging Meyer Lansky had pretty much retired from active gangsterism. And Chicago's Tony Big Tuna Accardo saw a chance for peaceful accommodation. According to law enforcement officials, Accardo went to the New York mobs with a deal. They could have Atlantic City. Chicago would stay out. If in return, Chicago would be given preferential rights to Las Vegas. That treaty of 1977 made Las Vegas essentially a province of the Chicago Syndicate. The man in charge, Chicago's provincial governor, tough Tony Spilotro, a cold-eyed hitman and enforcer for the Chicago mob.
And so Tony Spilotro became a very feared individual in this area, who traded on his reputation and the very name Tony Spilotro would instill and inspire fear in many people.
Spilotro and his henchmen had two primary responsibilities in Las Vegas. First, to maintain order on the streets, arbitrate disputes, and watch out for the Chicago mob's interests generally. Second, and more important, to provide the muscle necessary to keep the skim money flowing from casinos controlled by the Chicago Syndicate, the Stardust, Fremont, Marina, and Hacienda, all ostensibly owned by the Chicago mob's frontman in Las Vegas, Alan R. Glick. Glick acquired his casino holdings with the help of $67 million in loans from the Teamsters in 1973. His umbrella company in Las Vegas was called Argent Corporation.
It shows in a very simple way that there's no such thing as a free lunch. When Alan Glick got his $67 million pension fund loan from Central States, there were strings attached. He may not have realized until years later that there were strings attached, but it is obvious now with the benefit of hindsight that there were.
Whoever it is who is the recipient of the loan and the so-called owner of the casino finds himself in a position where he must tolerate, look the other way, ignore, or participate in the payback. And the payback is the skim. You don't enter into arm's length, purely legitimate business transactions with the LCN. The LCN is interested in one thing, and that is profit at any cost. And if it can't be obtained purely legitimately, it's going to be obtained through intimidation, fear, violence.
But at the time and throughout the 1970s, Teamsters loans were viewed as the milk of economic development in Nevada. So officials, like then Gaming Commission Chairman Harry Reid, were often quick to defend the Teamsters loans to Las Vegas, acknowledging that the $67 million to Glick looked a little fishy.
I mean, it's the man came to Las Vegas, borrowed $60-some-odd million from the pension fund, put $31 million of it in improvements in the Stardust Hotel. Money went into the Fremont down at Echo Bay. Those are concerns that we have, how somebody could get that kind of money. But if you look at the loans that the pension fund made all across the country, a lot of them don't make a good sense. We do know that the loans they made in the state of Nevada, without exception, are the best loans that they've made any place in the country. So how he got the loans, sure, that's an interesting question, and I don't know if there'll ever be an answer to it.
Targets of the federal probe included Joey Dove's Aiuppa, the capo dei tutti, or boss of all bosses; Jackie the Lackey Cerrone, Aiuppa's consigliere, or right-hand man; Angelo La Pietra, a capo regime in the Chicago Syndicate; Joey the Clown Lombardo, another capo regime. In Kansas City, capo dei tutti Nick Sevilla and his brother, consigliere Carl Sevilla. In Milwaukee, capo dei tutti Frank Fancy Pants Balistrieri and his sons. And finally, the Fed set out to nail the corrupt Teamsters Union president Roy Lee Williams, without whose cooperation the mob could not control Las Vegas. The prosecution theory: Aiuppa, Sevilla, Balistrieri, and the other mob bosses had used their clout with Teamster Roy Lee Williams to arrange Teamsters loans by which Alan Glick built his Las Vegas casino empire. The mob bosses paid off Williams and then told Glick that they would skim a portion of his casino proceeds as their end of the arrangement.
How that worked was a certain amount of cash was diverted each month. It was sent by trusted courier in a very circuitous route from here to Chicago. We know circumstantially that individuals, at least from Milwaukee and perhaps from Kansas City, were also participating in that skim. In fact, some electronic surveillance had an organized crime figure in Milwaukee referring to going to Chicago to get his transfusion. The man was not referring to a blood transfusion.
Once again, the federal investigation sent shockwaves careening through the Las Vegas establishment. Then Governor Bob List was found to have accepted $3,000 in complimentary services from the Stardust during the years he was Attorney General. List would later lose his bid for re-election. Joe Blasco, a detective on the police department's elite task force unit, was caught feeding confidential police reports to the Chicago mob's men in Las Vegas. He was kicked off the police force. Newspaperman Bob Brown, a respected editor and publisher, pleaded guilty in federal court to tax charges in connection with illicit Argent casino money being laundered through his business. Jerry May, a powerful political consultant and advertising executive, was also found guilty on tax charges stemming from the Argent case. Like the Tropicana case, the federal investigation of Argent demonstrated how the tentacles of organized crime had enveloped the legitimate Las Vegas business, social, and political community.
These loyalties and these bits of corruptions come from all different sources, and the how and why probably depends on which individuals you're talking about. Clearly, though, there had always been a stronger historic association between organized crime figures and citizens in Las Vegas because our community was built on gambling. And almost by definition, many of the people involved in the early years in Las Vegas got their training in illegal gambling operations in other parts of the country, and many of those operations were influenced or controlled by the Mafia.
Meanwhile, back in the Midwest, the crime bosses complained that they were the victims of harassment. Kansas City mob consigliere Corky Savella portrayed himself as a simple businessman.
Well, if they find people that I know, say for instance, there's him, Butch, Sal, people around here, Pat, all of them, any of these people, and ask any of them, they know me, they're born and raised. There's no man up there 90 years old when I was a kid. They know of me ever harming anybody. Any human being outside of trying to help somebody. Tell them to come up, bring somebody to prove it. Outside of the informers. How about someone is being paid to say something? That's a different story. But the one that's being paid won't confront me. They're you. And say out in the open, say, yes, I know Carl Savell, he's done this, he's done that, or he'll this and that. They won't say it to you, they won't say it to me, they won't say it to nobody. But they will tell them because that's what they want to hear. That's what they want to hear. That goes for the police department, most of them there, the FBI, the task force. That's all they're looking for. They're looking for some goat, somebody to pin on something to. They got a task force care. All they do is waste our taxpayers' money. They ride around the market here, they ride around the market all the time. They look, they take your license number, they follow you over here, they follow you home. Big deal.
In 1980, more FBI wiretaps surfaced. Union loan manipulator Alan Dorfman and Teamsters President Roy Williams had been caught on tape, conspiring to bribe Nevada Senator Howard Cannon. Cannon denied any wrongdoing.
These people were not charged with bribing me. They were charged with conspiring among themselves to attempt to bribe me, and they never tried to convey any bribe to me or never made any offers to me.
But the scandal cost him the United States Senate seat he had held for 24 years. Cannon would lose to Republican Chick Hecht in the 1982 election. Back then, Cannon hinted darkly of political conspiracies and government vendettas against Las Vegas.
I think it's rather interesting that the government would have that trial come along just before the election, but I don't know why it came about that way.
With Cannon's reluctant testimony for the prosecution, Dorfman and Williams were convicted. Then, amid talk that one or both men might turn government witness to avoid prison, the mob swung into desperate action with a message few could ignore. Frank Lefty Rosenthal, the former inside man at Argent, barely escaped with his life when his Cadillac exploded outside Tony Roma's restaurant on East Sahara Avenue. Alan Dorfman, the shadowy Teamsters fixer, would not be so lucky. In early 1983, he was gunned down in a Chicago parking lot, apparently so he could never tell what he knew about the Teamster mob connection in Las Vegas. This wave of violence triggered congressional hearings and testimony from FBI National Director William Webster.
Gangland executions are our most difficult crime. They use professionals, they pick their time and their place, and historically we've not been successful in these investigations. This one offers us a substantially better chance than any I can remember to solve, and we intend to solve it if it's at all possible to do so. This is a good lesson, I think, to those who think that they can get along successfully with the more vicious organized crime elements. There is no sense of obligation or loyalty, but simply one of survival.
But Dorfman's killers would never be caught. The former Argent frontman, Alan Glick, saw the handwriting on the wall. He talked to prosecutors and offered to become a witness, portraying himself as a victim of mob extortion, not as a partner in crime.
A very thin line between being a victim and an accomplice. It may depend on who's the first one to the prosecutor's office to make a deal.
Indictments came down from a Kansas City grand jury, and the mob bosses went on trial. Among the witnesses against them, Teamsters boss Williams, Alan Glick, the frontman, and Carl Thomas, the one-time casino executive. Aiuppa, Cerrone, and Balistreri all were convicted. So were a host of others. Suddenly, in 1985, the once feared Chicago Midwest crime syndicate was truly a headless monster. But for one man in Las Vegas, this situation only promised greater opportunity.
People who smile at you, and each time I roam Chicago it's calling me home, Chicago.
Watch yourself you don't get hit by a car.
He ruled the streets of Las Vegas with a deadly fist through the 1970s and 1980s. Chicago's man in Las Vegas, a ruthless enforcer, tough Tony Spilotro, Tony the Ant, implicated in more than 25 murders, but never convicted. His so-called death stare turned men's hearts to jelly. According to early Chicago police records, Tony Spilotro had grown into a major league thug before he ever grew out of short pants, avoiding conviction because the witnesses against him either lost their memories or died violently. He came to Las Vegas in 1971, opening a gift shop at Circus, and then moving in 1974 to the Dunes, where he set up operations in the casino poker room. But aware of his reputation and aware that he was the alleged mob overseer in Las Vegas, state officials objected.
And the owner of that hotel was asked if he would not have Tony leave the premises, at which time Tony has not been seen hanging around any other Nevada resort.
What was he allegedly doing at this hotel when you say he was hanging around the poker room? Could you elaborate what he was doing there? Was he allegedly?
He wasn't observed doing anything in particular. His mere presence in a licensed gaming operation was abhorrent to the authorities here in the state.
In 1978, state officials barred Spilotro from even entering a casino, placing his name in the Nevada Black Book of Notorious Persons.
Anthony John Spilotro does fall under our, is a person who is of notorious or unsavory reputation, that he has been convicted of a crime which is a felony in the state of Nevada or under the laws of the United States, a crime involving moral turpitude or a violation of a provision of this chapter, or whose presence in a licensed gaming establishment would be, in the opinion of the board and commission, be inimical to the interests of the state of Nevada or licensed gambling, or both, and that we vote to include him in our list of excluded persons.
There being no discussion, the secretary will call the roll.
Mr. Walsh?
Aye.
Mr. Cox?
Aye.
Mr. Swartz?
Aye.
Mr. Haycock?
Aye.
Mr. Reed?
Aye. This commission stands in adjournment.
It's clear from everything that we heard today that nothing has changed over the years regarding Mr. Spilotro, other than the fact that the federal authorities have created a situation where there's now a contest between the state of Nevada and the federal government to see who can abuse the rights of individuals most. That's all I have to say.
But despite an open censure by state gaming authorities, few in Las Vegas would talk badly about Tough Tony. They wouldn't dare, as evidenced by an embattled Frank Rosenthal in 1979, who even under state pressure of his own would not disown Spilotro.
I have known Tony Spilotro from the inception of his birth. I know his entire family. He is a personal friend of mine who I have not been able to associate with since moving to Las Vegas. However, certainly we both recognize the family ties and the lifelong friendship.
In addition to providing the muscle to make sure the Chicago skim flowed, Spilotro set up his own street rackets in Las Vegas. His gang included enforcers like former Metro cop Joe Blasco, who left the police force and joined Spilotro. Enforcer Fat Herbie Blitzstein, reputed labor racketeer Joey Cusimano. They were all loyal to their boss, as evidenced by this rare interview with killer for hire, Lawrence Newman, a key cog in Spilotro's machine.
Are you acquainted with Mr. Spilotro?
Very slightly. Never, our meetings were all chance meetings in a restaurant, in a bar, something like that. Nothing was ever planned like a social meeting or anything. I've never had any discussion with the man about anything criminal. Always just social talk. And if he's involved, it would be news to me because I have no knowledge of it.
You have not, in other words, never worked for Mr. Spilotro or anything like that?
No way, shape, or form.
But then, 6 Spilotro gang members were busted for a series of burglaries, the so-called hole-in-the-wall gang capers. Facing life in prison, another mob killer, Frank Cullota, turned government witness. He implicated his boss Spilotro in a host of crimes, including the 1978 murder of Sherwin Listner. Cullota said that he had been ordered by Spilotro to kill Listner because Listner had turned informant. Cullota described the night of the murder with chilling dispassion.
And I shot him almost by the ear or back of the head.
What happened when you first shot him?
He turned around and looked at me and screamed, "What are you doing?" And I shot him again in the head.
Cullota was in court yesterday. He is under very heavy protection, as much as you'd find as the President of the United States. What about stories that there's a $200,000 contract, mob contract, on Frank Cullota?
They're laughing at him. They're laughing at the FBI and the Metropolitan Police in Las Vegas. They've given this guy immunity for everything. 2 murders. Immunity for 2 murders, and like I say, he was going to reveal everything against everybody. He can't. He doesn't know anything. They bought a pig in the poke. The man is useless to them, other than trying to get me to corroborate what he's got to say. His lies.
But despite Larry Newman's protestations, his pal Tony Spilotro by 1983 was facing 3 separate racketeering indictments, including 1 RICO charge related to the Listner murder. But it was the Argent Skim case in Kansas City that would prove Tony's undoing. Alan Glick and Carl Thomas had testified against the Chicago mob bosses on trial in Kansas City, and the bosses took a dim view. As overseer in Las Vegas, it had been Tony Spilotro's duty to make sure they could not testify against the mob kingpins. When convictions came down in 1986, however, Spilotro viewed it as a personal opportunity. After all, with all the old bosses in prison, someone had to take control of the Chicago syndicate. Who more qualified than tough Tony Spilotro?
Mr. Spilotro, you said in court that you didn't...
No comments by Mr. Spilotro.
Okay. Amid speculation that he was a contender to the throne, the provincial governor in Las Vegas traveled in early June back to the Empire headquarters in Chicago. His primary rival for power was said to be this man, Joe Ferriola, a reputed mob capo who had escaped the government law enforcement net. On June 14th, Tony Spilotro and his younger brother Michael left Michael's Chicago home for a meeting. They did not return.
Good evening. Federal authorities tonight have issued a fugitive arrest warrant for mobster Tony Spilotro, but he is still officially a missing person at this moment.
Here in Illinois, a missing car has turned up. The 1986 Lincoln Continental Mark 7, in which Spilotro and his brother Michael were reported last seen in Oak Park.
The manhunt in Chicago intensified. Speculation mounted. What had happened to tough Tony?
Bill Romer, an expert on organized crime and a former FBI agent in Chicago. Romer believes the Spilotros are pulling a Joe Bonanno, faking their own disappearance to avoid upcoming trials. But others theorize that the Spilotros met with foul play. One theory, they were killed by a rival Chicago mob leader who viewed the Spilotros as potential rivals. Still others believe the Spilotros were liquidated by Eastern mobsters who want to take over Chicago's turf in Las Vegas.
Spilotro Chicago attorney Alan Ackerman remained optimistic.
I have an instinct. My instinct tells me that nothing is really wrong, that there'll be an explanation for their temporary disappearance when they return, when they surface.
Tony and Michael Spilotro were to surface again, but not in the way Alan Ackerman had predicted. On June 23rd, 9 days after their mysterious disappearance, their bodies were found buried in an Indiana cornfield just a few miles from a farm owned by convicted former boss Joey Aiuppa.
No evidence was offered in this case as to where the skim money went because of the nature of the charges. The charges were narrow. It was confined to a tax fraud within the state of Nevada, and all of the evidence was confined to the activities within the casino. However, there is substantial additional evidence which was not introduced at the trial, but which would support the inference clearly that substantial amounts of the skim money that was taken out the back door while the false fill slips were dropping in the boxes at the table was transported to Chicago, to organized crime interests in Chicago. And so I think that although there was a change in ownership in 1979 when Argent gave up its control of the casino and the Trans-Sterling Corporation assumed control of the casino, nevertheless, the Chicago mob continued to profit.
It was not until 1983 when the state began the process of revoking Sachs' license, forcing the 1985 sale of the Stardust and Fremont to the Boyd Group, that the Chicago mob's financial interest in these hotels finally came to an end. But while state officials confronted the organized crime syndicates on the licensing front, federal prosecutors here at the Foley Federal Courthouse were pursuing their own secret agenda. Back in 1970, Congress enacted a new law, the Racketeering Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. For short, they called it RICO.
What the RICO statute did was allow the Justice Department in its indictments to articulate clearly to juries all across the country exactly what they were going after in these organized crime cases. Very often cases which are in fact organized crime cases appear as travel act cases or gun cases or gambling cases, and the jury never gets the full picture about why these defendants are sitting in front of them on these charges. But the RICO statute gave prosecutors a way of articulating that the Mafia was organized into various families and that these families had a disciplinary structure and different people played different roles, and it helped prosecutors make sense of organized crime cases to juries.
As a federal prosecutor in the 1970s, Hunterton spearheaded a criminal investigation of the mob's hidden ownership in the Aladdin Hotel. As with Argent, the Aladdin had been funded with $37 million worth of Teamsters loans through the Alan Dorfman connection. As with Argent, the loans came with hidden strings and hidden owners. St. Louis lawyer Circus Webby was the mob's frontman at the Aladdin, a fact that he vigorously disputed in the early 1970s.
I have no knowledge of that whatsoever. I think it's unfounded. I think it's a figment of maybe the government's imagination or some other people's imagination. I have no evidence of that whatsoever.
It took the better part of a decade, but Webby would later be convicted of defrauding the Teamsters at the Aladdin. His silent partners, including associates of the old Detroit Purple Gang and Lebanese mob boss Jimmy Tamer, were convicted for exercising hidden ownership at the hotel. Armed with a new Nevada law, state officials forced the Aladdin into receivership, taking it out of the hands of the shareholders.
The Commission has issued an emergency order pursuant to Nevada law, effective immediately upon service, suspending the license of the Aladdin Hotel, which would require closure of the hotel. The closure order will be held in abeyance, however, by the Commission if the following terms and conditions are implemented by the Aladdin Hotel Corporation. Number one, that James Tamer, Edward Menazem, Charles Goldfarb, and James Abrams not come upon the premises of the Aladdin Hotel. Two,
that the present officers and directors, Richard Daley, Sam Diamond, Peter J. Webby, James G. Abram, and May Ellen George not come upon the premises of the Aladdin Hotel.
I think and I hope that this decision of mine and the other stockholders will bring to an end and put behind us the many, many hours of problems that have faced the Aladdin Hotel.
And in 1981, the Aladdin was sold to a new ownership group. The Dunes Hotel, funded with Teamsters loans and operated by Ellen Dorfman's pal, Morris Schenker, also came under federal investigation in the 1970s, probing the Dorfman-Schenker connection.
I've known Alan Dorfman probably 20 years or better. I knew his father. I knew Alan Dorfman, I think, before he ever went to the to become associated, before he ever went and became associated with the Central States Pension Fund. I knew Alan Dorfman. I still know Alan Dorfman. Alan Dorfman does come to the hotel. He is a good player, and there is nothing in the records which indicate that we should not permit Alan Dorfman to come in. The day I'm notified that Alan Dorfman is not a person that should come into the establishment, we wouldn't let him in, because I tried to observe the laws as strictly as possible as far as the gambling laws are concerned.
The Schenker probe has not yet yielded any indictments, but under the mounting pressure from federal prosecutors and state gaming control officials, Schenker sold his controlling interest in the Dunes in 1983, protesting all the while that he had done nothing wrong and had nothing to hide.
Let me put it to you like this. I can answer as follows. I know there is no organized crime or any hidden interest in the Dunes Hotel. I'm willing to stake my life, my reputation, and everything I've got on that statement. Now, when you ask me whether there is organized crime on the other hotels, I do not believe that it would be appropriate for me, without having studied, all I've read is the newspapers, without having studied the whole thing, to give an opinion. But I'll tell you this, I'm opposed to organized crime, not only in Las Vegas, I'm opposed to it in every manner, shape, or form. In my 47 years of practicing law, I have never been on a retainer. And I've had some of the biggest clients in the country, and some of the most important ones. I have never been on a retainer by anyone that was engaged in an illegal business. That does not mean that I did not represent them when they got in trouble. But they had to be in trouble first before I would represent them. I had nothing to do with their business, never concerned myself with their business. I was also on a case-to-case basis when they employed me. And it's a policy I followed during my entire career, and I certainly don't intend to change it now.
As long as Las Vegas had the image of a town dominated by organized crime, it could never hope to attract legitimate investment. But now, the absence of a ruling force on the Las Vegas streets has created a power vacuum in the underworld, a vacuum that others want to fill. There simply is too much cash floating around the Strip. So in the past 6 months, since Tony Spilotro's departure, East Coast mob families have been sending representatives into Las Vegas. Families such as Fat Tony Salerno's New York Genovese crime family. Salerno went to prison this month for 100 years, but he left behind 200 family members to carry out the Genovese faction's mission. Former FBI agent Jim Mulroy is an expert on the East Coast mobs.
Las Vegas is wide open. Money is to be made out here. This is the perfect place for the New York hoodlum who is trying to avoid the heat to come out here and enjoy the sun and make money.
That's right. That's right. I think all of the families, Open City, however you want to call it, always want a piece of the action, and they always want to increase that piece of the action. And I think getting together again and trying to reestablish themselves here.
Right now we see indicators. There's no hard core evidence at this point in time, but as to who is going to be the predominant family coming into Las Vegas. But right now there are some warning signs out that Metro and the FBI we're monitoring very closely.
Last Thanksgiving, associates of the New York Buffalo crime family were captured in these undercover surveillance photos, conducting secret meetings with West Coast crime figures along the Las Vegas Strip, perhaps mapping out a vision of the future. Lee Coppola is a news reporter who has covered the Buffalo mob for more than a decade.
At one time, it was as powerful as any of the New York families when it was dominated by Stefano Magaddino, but in recent years it has lost that power, and now if it wants a branch out from Buffalo, it has to go through the New York families.
You have the same situation in New York. Heads of the families have met their Donnybrook. They're ready for sentencing. But there are other people up there in New York to take their place, and they may find it hot for them in New York. They're going to go anywhere that they can to establish a fountainhead of more money and influence.
Well, if you owned a plant and you weren't making money in your location, wouldn't you maybe branch out and try different businesses or different areas where maybe people were spending more money? And it's basically the same thing in the underworld. If there's no money coming in, for instance, a lot of money came in factories because so many thousands of factory workers would play the sports pools everywhere. Of course, it's not like Nevada, gambling's illegal. So the mob always had its influence in the sports gambling network. Thousands and thousands of factory jobs were lost in the Rust Belt Depression. So therefore, that's a lucrative opportunity that the mob in Buffalo has now lost.
Of course, what we have to watch for is limited only by the imagination and ingenuity of the organized crime interests who would seek to gain a foothold in this community, or those which may already have a foothold in the community. But I don't think that anything is going to change all that dramatically. While great efforts and strides have been made in cleaning up the corrupt casino business, that is, those casinos over which organized crime had control. Nevertheless, the bottom line still remains that the most lucrative venture that any organized crime interest can have in Las Vegas is to skim money from casino operations.
Whatever his vices, law enforcement officials say, Tony Spilotro's presence in Las Vegas created a measure of stability. Now the officials are plainly worried about the potential for a mob version of Hobbs' war of all against all, as other mafia clans vie for supremacy on the Strip.
One thing that we're concerned about is it going to erupt in any type of violence? And the sad part of it is the innocent citizen that gets caught in between these two factions at the time this violence may erupt. I think it's a very real concern of the community as a whole, is the violence it might lead to.